Good morning and happy International Women's Day. This is a particularly special Women's Day because it is taking place in a situation of coronavirus and pandemic worldwide. And one of the big stories that has been emerging from the pandemic is the impact of the coronavirus on women and girls' rights. And the picture is not pretty, but the good news is that there are things that we can do about this situation as societies, as journalists, as people who care about women and girls' rights. It is my very great honor today to introduce you to two extraordinary women journalists who have played a very important leadership role when it comes to these questions. The first is Judy Kaberia, and Judy is an award-winning multimedia journalist and media trainer who works with Journalists for Human Rights in Kenya as our gender media trainer. Judy brings over 16 years of experience in journalism to the craft. She's a dedicated journalist with excellent spoken and verbal communication skills, and she has extensive knowledge in global journalism, human rights, and media development in East Africa and in Africa writ large. She is a 2015 fellow of the prestigious Edward R. Murrow Program for Journalists in Washington. She's a media trainer for the Professional Development Program of the Graduate School for Media and Communications at the Aga Khan University in Nairobi. And she's also been an international consultant with the United Nations Development Program on journalism training in South Sudan. Before all of this work, she worked as a journalist and later as an associate editor for Capital Group Limited, the proprietors of Capital FM. She's the board chair of Africa Check Foundation in Kenya, a subsidiary of Africa Check Trust, Africa's leading independent fact-checking organization. She regularly speaks on Kenya's mainstream media about journalism, and as it happens today, she is on the op-ed page in the Globe and Mail, right in the center, making sure that we are in Canada all aware about the impact of the coronavirus on women's and girls' rights in Kenya and what we can all do about that situation. The second extremely impressive journalist that we will be bringing on this webinar today is Josephine Schmidt. Josephine is the executive editor of the New Humanitarian based in Geneva. She joined in 2018 as the first executive editor of the New Humanitarian. She is an experienced journalist, newsroom leader, and media strategist with over 17 years of international newsroom, op-ed, and editorial development experience at the New York Times. She has lived and worked in Asia, Europe, and North America, launching and managing multilingual websites, magazines, multimedia projects, breaking news coverage, and special projects on everything from culture to politics. She has also worked with heads of state, Nobel laureates, artists, dissidents, scientists, and business leaders to craft timely and impactful op-ed and analysis pieces. As the editorial lead of the New York Times News Service and Syndication Division, she oversaw the development and distribution of multi-platform content from the New York Times and other leading media companies to organizations around the world. She began her career, interestingly, in nonprofit media in post-communist Eastern Europe, where she helped to establish the region's first post-Soviet journalism training center, and she then played key roles in launching and leading Transitions, a website and magazine covering the politics, economy, and culture of 27 post-Soviet countries. Welcome, Judy and Josephine. And Judy, I'm wondering if we can start with you, and if you could just put this audience in the picture of what you have been doing just over the past week in the service of women and girls' rights in media in Kenya.
Thank you very much, Rachel, for this opportunity and putting this together. It comes at the right time because we have a lot of issues that are affecting women and girls in this country. And one of the main issues that actually led to the couple of activities that we had last week and last week batch one is underrepresentation of women in the news. In Kenya, we have less than 30% of women in editorial position, meaning that we have very few women who can decide what content goes, who is interviewed, and who is the most important in terms of the news coverage. And because of this low percentage of representation of women in the news, that's when we decided as JHR, through the Kenya project, the Voice for Women and Girls' Rights, to put together a group of female journalists. And we started with the junior reporters who actually narrated the nasty experiences that they go through as news reporters. And they face a lot of harassment, sexual harassment, intimidation, and undermining of their professionalism both within the newsroom and outside the newsroom. And after that, we had a second event where we involved a senior female journalists at the decision-making table. And we were able actually to come with a way forward. Finally, I think we got it right into taking action and deciding how we respond to sexual harassment in the newsroom. And one of the recommendations is for us to have an ad hoc committee, which is independent from the newsroom, because recently we had a case of a young girl in her 20s, very young girl who faced sexual harassment. She broke down. We were with her on phone. That is last week. And last week, but one, she came to this female journalist meeting that we had. The entire room with around 15 women all broke down into tears. We just cried because of kind of violation she's been going through. And finally, through the support of JHR, we are able to say at least soon we are going to give birth to a baby that is going to respond to this menace.
Amazing. It's amazing work. Thank you. Josephine, could you share with us a little bit about your work at New Humanitarian?
Oh, with pleasure. And thank you, Rachel, for inviting the New Humanitarian and myself to talk about issues that are very near to our work and our hearts on this International Women's Day. And Judy, thank you for sharing that story. I look forward to hearing more. The New Humanitarian is celebrating now 26 years of journalism from the heart of humanitarian crises. So we put our journalism at the service of people who are often enduring some of the most traumatic events of their lives. And we do that in the hope that our information will help inform the prevention of similar events and inform the response, humanitarian response to those events. We're one of the few, if not only, independent not-for-profit newsrooms dedicated to reporting from the heart of humanitarian crises, which means we're on the ground around the world. We were in 70 countries last year. We're a tiny newsroom of about 10 full-time staff, including our web developer and audience engagement editor. And we work very closely with freelance contributors around the world, working with local journalists who are able to really get us the story from the inside out. We report on everything from conflict and post-conflict zones to displacement situations arising from conflict, such as those in Syria or South Sudan, or climate refugees, to economic and political migrants, such as people who are in the midst of the situation on the Colombia-Venezuela border, or the US border for that matter. We also cover natural hazards arising from storms, earthquakes, health emergencies, the Ebola outbreak in Congo, and that pandemic that has taken over all of our lives. We do all of that with the hope of really amplifying the voices at the people who are at the heart of these crises. For a sense of what we cover, if you go to our site, you can take a look at our annual 10 crises and trends to watch in 2021 list. It's a list we put together every year. This year, of course, many of those trends were informed, shaped by the pandemic. So we had, as always, a few events that were very geographic in nature, everything from Ethiopia and the unrest in Tigray and elsewhere, to Yemen, which still holds the sad moniker of the world's worst humanitarian crisis, but also to broader trends, such as food insecurity being fueled by rising prices, and of course the fallout of the pandemic, to rollbacks in fighting infectious diseases, again, pointing to the pandemic as a culprit because vaccination programs and simple access to healthcare have become more difficult. And this year, one of our 10 crises is the added toll that COVID is taking on women and girls. So our coverage of women and girls is really quite centered in our work.
That is incredibly important work that you're doing. And I hope that later in the conversation, you can share a little bit about the She Said
Yes.
segment that you've been leading at the New Humanitarian. And I hope that for this audience, if you hadn't heard of the New Humanitarian before, please do check out the website. It's a really, really interesting news organization spun out of the US IRIN News Service that is now working extremely hard to hold the humanitarian system to account to ensure that the voices of those who, in theory, are the beneficiaries but are often left out of the conversation about how to engage with humanitarian crises, that they are at the center of coverage and that their voices are leading in terms of what needs to be done in the places where they are coping with extreme circumstances. So thank you very much, Josephine, and we'll hear more shortly, but I'm going to turn back to Judy for a minute. And Judy, could you share with us a little bit, you alluded to it a little bit in your opening remarks, what has been the impact of the coronavirus on women working in the media in Kenya? You'd mentioned that, you know, the statistics are already not good, less than 30% of women working in decision-making roles. But what has this all meant in terms of women's ability to work in media in Kenya?
Yes, actually, up to now, we are grappling with the massive job losses, especially among female journalists, because when Corona came, over 400 journalists lost their jobs. Unfortunately, majority of these journalists are female journalists. And one of the reasons that is used to target on female journalists is about, is she likely to get married? Is she likely to be pregnant? Is she likely to take maternity leave? There's nothing professional that is looked at a woman when she's supposed to be laid off. And because of, being a woman, that is why they become the almost obvious target. And we've ended up losing very good journalists. And I can tell you from experience, when a woman is in the newsroom, first they're given softer subjects, launch of a soap, launch of, t-shirt or something of the sort. And so it becomes very difficult to climb her way up there. And the biggest challenge, of course, is like sexual harassment and this sort of intimidation. If somebody is facing sexual harassment or is being undermined at work, then it means their performance will be quite low. If their performance is quite low, then this woman cannot get to the top level. And that's why we have a lot of women leaving the newsrooms prematurely. Others underperform, yet they have the capability to perform. And this is why through JHR, we really hope that the kind of effort that we're employing in the programs that we have, including training female journalists, because in all our trainings, we always ensure majority of the beneficiaries are women. And actually, we've had fantastic story proposals that women are sending to us. And for us, this is a win-win situation, because apart from, empowering the women with the skills and the knowledge, especially to report from a human rights perspective, and also to inject gender sensitivity in reporting, we hope this is also going to close the gaps, because again, when we look at how women are covered in media, we see a lot of stereotyping. We see women not recognized as news sources, because again, we have like only 30%, 35% of women are regarded as sources. Whereas we have fantastic women who've done fantastic things in this country. But for some reason, you just find that the coverage of these women is quite low in the media. But we hope through this kind of training that we are offering at JHR, we are likely to see a change, because most of the stories that have come forward are looking at issues of underage pregnancies, teen mothers, female genital mutilation. And I'll discuss this later as we move forward, because these are some of the serious things that we think that have already taken us really back when you talk about empowering girls and women. And actually, for us, COVID-19 has been like the shadow pandemic that unfortunately is not being given the seriousness in terms of resources, the time, and the programs that are being designed.
Yeah. All themes that I've heard echoed around the world in some of our other programs, Judy, but thank you for crystallizing them so effectively. Josephine, what have you been experiencing and seeing in your networks in terms of how coronavirus has affected women's ability to work in media?
Yeah, well, Judy, the story you tell is very familiar, because I think it's happening around the world when we talk about large layoffs and salary cutbacks and even wholesale shuttering of media outlets, with women losing jobs. And as they lose jobs, they lose voice. And as they lose voice, the access to women's stories and information on women's issues diminishes greatly. I think for women who were already underrepresented in the media to begin with, both in terms of workforce, the number of women journalists, and in terms of representation as sources in stories, it's an especially fraught time because as Judy mentioned earlier, not only do women in media tell stories, they also look at how those stories are told. And so when you lose women in media, you lose the gatekeepers of what is the news, what is worth telling. To me, that means that those of us who are still fortunate to be able to play an active part in the media, it's imperative to double down on our commitment to amplifying the voices of women, both in the topics we choose to report and the way in which we report those stories. There's a line from the Op-Ed Project, which is a project that's dedicated to helping to ensure there are more women's voices on the opinion pages of media sites around the world. And their line is, "Whoever tells the story writes history." And if we're in a moment now when there are fewer women in the media workforce, there's a whole different story that's going to be told than the story that is really happening out there.
It's a great line. And that's great work. The Op-Ed Project, please everybody take note. There's also an organization called Informed Opinions that does similar work in Canada, really, really valuable work. And if there are news editors and directors out there watching this webinar, please check out both of those projects, because one of the goals here is to ensure that we have more women being quoted as sources and as experts and being featured in order to ensure that those narratives are shared and that women's perspectives are better understood and better working to frame the experiences that we're going through. And the situation in Canada is no different. An RBC study came out late last week that indicated that over 100,000 women have left the workforce of working age. The figure is 10 times smaller than men. And to be clear, we're not saying in this webinar that men have not suffered in the course of the pandemic. Of course they have. Everyone is suffering as a result of this pandemic. But the impact, at least in Canada, based on these numbers from RBC, is 10 times greater in terms of the numbers of women who have left the workforce, whether it has been because they've been pushed out, because to your point, Judy, there is this situation where often there's an assumption that there's a boyfriend or a husband or some sort of other support that the woman can rely on, and therefore her job is less important and less necessary to protect, or a scenario where women are simply facing other problems. But in any event, let's move on to the next topic. And Judy, if you could share with us a little bit about what the broader impact of the coronavirus has been on women and girls' rights in Kenya.
Yeah, Rachel, actually COVID-19 just showed us the ugly face of violations against girls and women. Working as a journalist reporting on human trafficking, I just came, very close to incidences that I think I'll never forget in my life. Seeing very young girls at the age of 11, pregnant, and worried how they are going to give birth and not even understanding or even not knowing who the father of the child is. And, even the innocence or even trying to understand what happened to them. Some of these images I'll never forget. And I keep on remembering this girl who has just turned 11, and now she's a mother taking care of a child breastfeeding a child. And her education has been cut short. She probably may never go back to school, but I hope someday we'll be able to rally some CSOs to be able to get her back to school. And this is the first time, actually, I thought my role as a journalist went beyond reporting, trying to become like the police or a lawyer or something, because some of the things that I saw didn't allow me as a human being just write the story and walk away. It went to trying to follow up, get justice, get them into a shelter house, get them some sort of support, some food, some clothes. This is what it changed from becoming a journalist to becoming like sort of a humanitarian and law and everything else. And the second story that I'll never forget is this 4-year-old girl who was defiled. She's only 4, at the age of 4. And I tried my best going to the children's officer, trying to get this guy behind bars. And up to now, this file is gathering dust at the police station. And these are just a few of the cases that we saw, because by June 2020, schools closed in Kenya in March 2020. By June 2020, we had about 152,000 girls who are pregnant. These are pregnant girls. And one of the things that I have to warn you about Kenya is that this data is quite insufficient. It doesn't capture everybody, because it only captures the people either who go to a health center or people who report to the police. Unfortunately, most of these cases are not reported. Only now an upsurge of backdoor abortions has also been reported. And this, again, what does it mean for young girls? You can imagine girls taking some detergents, taking a whole bottle for the fetus to come out, or a girl who decides she can lie on her back and have women step on her stomach for the fetus to go out. These are kind of sad stories that we are dealing with. Others who have to use twigs and knives to try and bring out the fetus. And as a result of that, we are losing the girls, the unborn babies, and some of them have got, physical and emotional trauma that will never walk away. Just early this month, on 1st of March, the government again has sent more alarming news. Just one county, in Kenya we have 47 counties, and just one county has recorded 10,000 girls who became pregnant again. We are in March. So you can see the ugly face that we're talking about that COVID-19 has showed us. It's just, a sorry state. And this means that all the gains that we made before COVID, unfortunately, most of them have been undone. As we talk now, Rachel, the reality is some of the girls are still stuck with their perpetrators. Some of them are commodified. After they were impregnated, the perpetrator was asked, if you pay us this amount of money, just give us a sheep or a goat and a cow, and you can marry this girl, she can become your wife. So we have 10-year-olds, 12-year-olds, 13-year-olds serving as wives of some old men. And this goes silently because of cultural values, because of historical injustices that we've never addressed boldly by rebuking our cultural backgrounds. And again, we have a lot of girls who have gone through female genital mutilation. You can imagine a society that believes a woman cannot become complete if we don't take away a piece of her body flesh away from her. You can imagine that. And this is a society that thinks that we either take a bit of it or the whole of it for them to become a woman. And this is the sad reality. During COVID, again, these have escalated. We were hoping, like in Kenya, for example, by 2020, we'll eradicate female genital mutilation. But now we are dealing with another crisis where the numbers have gone up and people have gone back, to practicing female genital mutilation. But today, I also applaud the brave women in communities that have decided to call off this kind of backward culture and led the war against female genital mutilation. Today, I celebrate them because I know people, the likes of Josephine Kulea, who has started a rescue center of saving girls from, underage marriages, from female genital mutilation, and giving them education to continue. And I celebrate her because some of the girls have even graduated with degrees, masters, and all that. So at the same time, yes, this is the downside of it. And we also have another woman who's just opened a school in Nyeri, not far from here in Nairobi. And this school is giving hope and providing education to teen mothers, some with their babies and taking care of the women, of the children and the girls. So at the same time, yes, there are these hurdles that we are facing, but we have a lot of brave women who've taken this head-on collision and provided solution. It's so sad that even these girls who have been exposed, their vulnerability has shot up. They're more exposed to further, victimization, to further sexual abuse, child exploitation. All these numbers have escalated because even their mothers lost their jobs, their fathers lost their jobs. So they're forced to go and work as house girls at the risk of, violating their right to education and their right to enjoy their childhood. That is the sad state we are in. And I don't know how long we have to deal with this, but one thing that I know, the power of the media, a lot of what we are doing at JHR, I know some of these stories will be able to raise, the issues that have not been addressed to try and remove some of these hurdles from our young girls.
Wow. Wow, Judy, what an experience. What a situation that you've been navigating, and these extraordinary stories that you've been telling and sharing and engaging with on a human level, as well as on the level of being a journalist. And I know that that can be challenging and complex. And sometimes there are questions where you want to make sure that not only is the story told, but that justice is done. And that is a very complex line to navigate. More to ask you about shortly. But Josephine, I wonder if you can share what you've seen from your position as the executive editor of New Humanitarian, looking at all these crises around the world. What are you seeing in terms of the impact of COVID-19 on women and girls' rights?
Sure. Well, at the New Humanitarian, we cover crises and vulnerable communities day in, day out as our bread and butter. And as the global pandemic took hold last March, we began thinking about how, once again, women were going to be getting the short end of the stick, as it were. They already, in humanitarian crises, often bear a disproportionate burden in that they are navigating dangers, they're navigating scarcity. They're also often in charge single-handedly of caring for children, feeding children, looking after their safety, etc. And that all of those challenges were going to be much magnified by the pandemic. So we wanted to think about how could we really focus, really bear down on their stories and on what women were experiencing. We already do quite a lot of women-centered storytelling, as our brilliant investigative editor, Paisley Dodds, pointed out. And she suggested that we spend some time really finding women and asking them how they are experiencing the pandemic. So that led to our launching the She Said series, Women's Lives, Women's Voices. And the point of this series is to have women tell stories in their own words. So it's not only the stories we tell, which are stories that are their stories, but that they are told through their words and through their voices, that we're not picking out a woman and representing her as a victim, as a refugee, as someone who is waiting for something to happen. We are representing her, talking to her, having her tell her story in an active way. So for us, that means that throughout 2020, we saw many of the things that that Judy mentioned. Everything from, of course, an increase in GBV, which there's been plenty of media attention around the world to this, as of course the entire world has become a crisis situation, really for the first time in my memory, perhaps in all of our memory. But for women in vulnerable situations, this was amplified by the fact that women who were living in refugee camps or in small displaced communities were at times confined with their abusers, or if not with their abusers, near their abusers. There was no access to helplines because the people who were manning those helplines were no longer working, or safe houses were shut down because of movement restrictions. Access to healthcare was more difficult as well. So for women who were abused, it was difficult for them to get help. We saw a great amount, of course, of economic hardship that for women who are living in fragile and vulnerable communities could tip them into poverty, tip them into food security, meaning really that there is not enough for their kids to eat. Malnourishment takes hold, and futures are severely hobbled. Access to healthcare, with lack of access, maternal and infant mortality rates in fragile societies were at risk of increasing. We spoke to some women in Nepal who were caught in a situation where more and more were giving birth at home. And that was, of course, increasing chances of danger, increasing maternal mortality rates, etc. We also looked at instances that led to loss of education. Girls could no longer go to school, either because because of mobility restrictions or because of lack of income. Their families no longer had jobs. They couldn't pay fees. When that happens, as we know, child marriage increases. We had a story out of Cameroon that one of our very intrepid young journalists did. It required a 24-hour bus ride, of course, winning the trust of young girls, one of whom had been married off at 16 because her father, who was a herder, did not want another mouth to feed. He had lost income, and she would not be returning to school when the schools opened again. And one thing that we saw over and over again is that for many women around the world, COVID-19 did not represent one problem or one challenge to overcome. What it did was it amplified existing challenges and just made everything that much harder.
Yeah, I think that's a really insightful and important point. There's been this sort of cascading effect where situations where a woman, for example, had a tenuous hold on a job, and then she had to homeschool her kid as well as work from home or other types of accommodations that needed to be made, and it just made it that much harder to hold on to those positions, let alone thrive in them. And meanwhile, we're seeing all these other cascading effects as women and girls leave formal workplaces, leave education, and become ever more vulnerable to situations such as child marriage, such as being trafficked. Judy, I know you've done a lot of work on the issue of human trafficking in particular. I'm wondering if you can share for this audience some examples of the work that you did and the impact that it had. Just on the theme of, whilst this is all terrible, it also means that there's an awful lot that we can do, both as journalists and Josephine and I sitting in our roles in the international community, things that we can do. But if you could share what you did in Kenya with your coverage of human trafficking for this audience, that'd be great.
Yes, when COVID was first announced in Kenya in March, one of the things actually I realized was I received was a distress call from a girl who got my number from some security officer, and she told me that they were locked up in some, a small tiny room in one of the slums, not far, just a few kilometers away from Nairobi, and it was like 29 girls stacked together in one room. When I actually entered there, I just found them sleeping on the floor. They'd not eaten for several days. Some were sick. They didn't have access to medication. But the agent had already locked them inside and left. So the police came and they rescued them. And by the time they were rescuing them, we had travel restrictions across the country. So these women, majority of them were not able to travel because they come from the remote parts of the country. And some of them were arrested in that process. So you can imagine now, would I go write the story or would I first try to get them, get them clearance for them to travel? So again, I started calling the police officers, the connection that I had, and at least we managed to get them together with the CSO as well. We had very good CSOs, and together we were able to push for them to be allowed to travel back to where they came from. And I did that story, and at the same time, I was still receiving more calls from Kenyans who were trapped in the Middle East. We had some Kenyans in Lebanon and Saudi Arabia. They were kicked out of where they were working and thrown to the streets. And most of them do not have travel documents with them. The moment they get to where they work, first they exploited, slavery, sex exploitation, torture, and so many other violations that happen to them. And they're like slaves because without any identification or travel documents, you can't go anywhere. So again, we started, I wrote that story and I got calls from the immigration department. And again, together with the CSOs, we were able to try and repatriate some of them. It took a very long time, but through the pressure of the articles that I wrote, there was a lot of response, and I would get calls from the immigration ministry, from the CSOs. And at the same time, we were doing a lot of outreach. I would go and talk to the younger women to try and tell them, they have to be very careful, especially when they are promised jobs, because traffickers target vulnerable people in the community. And that's why now with COVID-19 and women having lost their financial muscle, most of them are now vulnerable. And that's why I wrote another story where I warned about an upsurge of, human trafficking, because we have more vulnerable women who are being targeted by these traffickers. The second story that I interacted with is some girls from Nepal and India who had been trafficked to Kenya, and they were recruited into something they call mujra dancers. So mujra dancers, it's where young women are forced to dance and are anybody is free to pick them up and go do with them whatever they want. So when these girls were rescued, I found them in a police cell. They were held as criminals. So this is where, instead of giving victims the support that they require, a rescue center, psychosocial support, taking care of them, their father violated. You can imagine, I rescue a victim, and instead of me taking them, where they're supposed to be, I threw them into the police cell. So again, we employed a lot of pressure. There was a press conference that was done by one of the CSOs that I was working with. I covered the story, and we demanded for their release and repatriation. Again, I then wrote a story about lack of shelters in Kenya, because when you rescue people, you have nowhere to take them. We had incidences where a nurse treated a victim and she didn't have anywhere to go. So the nurse decided, let me just go with her because I have nowhere to take her to. And so many people, individuals, just offer, let me just go with these kids because I can't let them go back. Because the other scenario is letting them go back to the perpetrator, somebody who had trafficked them. That's another scenario that is there. So after I did this story about lack of shelters, and also I showed the procedural and structural hurdles that, block the justice system, there was a response, and the response was very positive, because I sat at the committee that was deliberating about establishment of shelters, especially to cater for victims of human trafficking. Because another thing that I highlighted in my story was that if we don't put these survivors somewhere, then it means the case cannot succeed in court. Because how will the case succeed in court when you don't have any complainant coming forward? So we pushed, and I'm happy that there's a lot of progress in that. We already had one of the shelter houses launched, which is a public one in one of the counties not far from here. And the government is making plans to have more of that done. And what I like is that they recognize the fact that I was a whistleblower of this, structural challenge that was, violating the survivor's father. And a lot of reforms have also gone through the immigration laws, especially concerning the workers moving to Saudi Arabia and Lebanon, because there are a lot of inconsistencies within the law that expose the girls to further violation. And so we hope very soon this will, go forward. And the minister keeps on telling me, we are working on it, Judy, we are working on it, Judy. And this is why I really like what I do, especially passing this kind of impact and solution-oriented journalism to the journalists that we are dealing with. And actually, this is what we're encouraging right away. I mean, right now with the kind of grants that we are offering to journalists, where journalists, write stories based on issues, and not just a matter of sensationalization or not a matter of winning an award, but it's about making a change in the society, influence policies, to promote our discourse, to create awareness. And for me, this is the true meaning of journalism. And I'm happy this is exactly what we are doing as the Voice for Women and Girls' Rights Kenya, which is the JHR project. And and one thing that I also like, Rachel, is that also we are working with the groups from the grassroots. These are the community media houses, because this is where a lot of these violations take place. When you talk about gender-based violence, these violations are taking place at high rates. And unfortunately, this is a group of population that are not aware about their rights being violated. In the first place, they don't even know it's a violation that is being, done to them. And because of the kind of work that we are doing, the community media, they're able to have, live and feedback from the people. And we've already had fantastic on-air shows supported by Voice for Women and Girls' Rights through Journalists for Human Rights. And actually, there's a lot of feedback, because these things can finally be discussed. And by having a discussion, it means us changing the policies to address the kind of challenges that women and girls are facing in this country.
Mobilizing media to change lives. Love it. It's a fundamental trope of the way that Journalists for Human Rights works. I remember when we were in Sierra Leone, we worked with rural radio stations, a transistor in a tree kind of scenarios, in order to do stories on domestic violence, because the war was over in Sierra Leone for the men, but for the women, it had only just begun as they started to absorb all the post-traumatic stress of the men that the men were bringing back from the conflict. So we had one journalist, Isata Kamara, who worked with a Ugandan trainer, Andrew Iwoku, on putting a human face on what that did to families, like what domestic violence could do to families in these communities. And I remember there was this network of tribal councils. We had mentioned that there was a Domestic Violence Act in Sierra Leone. It had been passed in 2007. It was quite progressive in terms of supporting women's and children's rights in a domestic violence situation. And the tribal councils network indicated that they took it upon themselves as their responsibility to enforce that legislation that they had not known about before this journalism was done. Excellent. Very powerful work. Thank you, Judy. It is really an honor to work with an individual of your caliber, and I'm so grateful that we're able to showcase the work that you've been doing with the Kenya team in this way. Josephine, I'm wondering if you can share your thoughts in terms of what is the role of journalists? How can journalists lead in this moment where we're seeing this cratering of women's access to employment opportunity, other impacts on women's rights and women's and girls' rights? What can journalists do to address the situation?
Yeah, I have three thoughts I'd like to share, and I think that they are all ways that we can perhaps, if not mitigate, at least draw attention to and create awareness of some of the challenges women, especially women in vulnerable situations, are facing during COVID-19, as well as those ongoing impacts of societal, political, economic assumptions and expectations around the lives of women and girls. So the first is to challenge dominant narratives about women's roles, about women's abilities, about their hopes. That's good practice for any journalist anywhere, really. Avoid assumptions, avoid the expected narrative, avoid the easy cause and effect explanations. To us at the New Humanitarian, nuance clearly articulated is a powerful, powerful tool. What we find time and again is if you go in and you're absolutely curious and you're looking at not only what did happen, but what could happen and why what happened took place, you get a much, much, much better story. One example is another one of our fabulous journalists, Stephanie Glinsky in Afghanistan, had noticed that there were very few women who were in data on COVID infections, and rather than thinking, oh, no women are contracting this, she did a little digging, went to hospitals, etc. And what it turned out was women were simply not going to be tested. They were not going to hospitals because it was culturally, it was very difficult for them to travel. They couldn't travel alone. Their husbands or male relatives did not want to travel. And so basically half of the population was cut out of any sort of data. And that's a story we got by really asking what's not there and what's missing. Second, I think now is the time more than ever to use our reporting, our voice as the media to hold those in power accountable, to ask the hard questions and to follow up. And to do that in a non-combative and fact-based manner, one that's fueled by conviction and what we at the New Humanitarian often like to think of as calm moral outrage. Yet calm moral outrage that's firmly rooted in on-the-ground reporting data and clearly sourced facts. One example I can share, which is not COVID related, but certainly women focused, is our investigations on sexual exploitation and abuse in the Ebola response in Congo. This was a project that was led and is still being led, where we're doing a series of stories on what appear to be sex for work schemes during the 2 years that aid workers were responding to the needs of communities that were at the center of the Ebola outbreak. And the impact of that was that after publishing our story, which was an investigation we did with Thomson Reuters Foundation, in which we had more than 50 women sharing their experiences in these sex for work schemes, the President's Office of DRC sought out a call with us to hear more about what had happened. World Health Organization, I think, close to 30 of the women said that the men with whom they were in contact were from the World Health Organization. So WHO, the UN's Children's Agency, and a handful of other NGOs pledged investigations into these accusations on reporters' findings. These are investigations that we're following up on. The UN Victims Advocate made a statement and committed to making plans to support the victims, etc. Our reporters spoke before the UK Parliament International Development Committee's inquiry into sexual exploitation and abuse in the aid sector, etc. So if one holds those in power to account, things can happen, change can happen. And finally, I think now is the time when we really need to make a commitment to assist women in amplifying their voices, to telling their stories, to ensuring that their stories are heard, and to ensuring that that women again are allowed to be and are seen as people who are in power of their lives, who can take action. One example I'd like to share is that in our reporting on the communities of Venezuelans who were living along the Colombian border, we had a story that came in, which was a great story in showing the sort of pile up and add on challenges that the pandemic presented to people who were already living in very fragile circumstances. The story opened saying that one young Venezuelan woman could no longer make food or sew. She was struggling to feed her kids, etc., etc. But in fact, what she was doing was, because she couldn't do these jobs, she had started selling ice. And to me, this was an incredible story of power, that this woman who could no longer sell food because because she could not go and get the ingredients, she could no longer take in sewing because mobility was limited. She started selling ice in her neighborhood in order to have enough money to pay her rent and feed her kids. And we then framed our story with her in that position, rather than in the position of a victim who was sadly, had less than she had before. So I think that type of framing, that type of story, where we're really sort of putting the power in the hands of the women, not in a Pollyannish, oh, everything is great way, but in a way that looks toward what is possible, can be tremendously powerful.
Incredible. Fantastic example. Wow. Well, this has been an extremely powerful conversation thus far, and there's more to come. There's questions now that are coming in from the audience. So I'm going to direct the first question at you, Judy, and then Josephine, if you want to jump in. There's a stereotype that women are their own enemies of progress that is quite commonly held. How can we demystify this in storytelling and avert more harm to women journalists? That stereotype that she, it's always the woman's fault in some way, shape, or form. If the situation is happening, somehow she is somehow responsible for it, and she's held to a standard that's usually 3 to 4 times higher than men in terms of holding that responsibility and then that shame in whatever it is that has happened to her. So what can we do to upend that particular stereotype that women are enemies?
Yeah, one of the things that I'm happy with, we're already doing at the Voice for Women and Girls' Rights Kenya, is to train journalists, university students studying journalism, and CSOs on gender responsive reporting. And some of the things that actually we are highlighting during the trainings is to focus on those issues, like that women are their own enemies. These are some of the things that actually we've been using examples because actually this is a weapon that has always been used to fight women, especially when they say they want to vie for, elective seats. And whenever they say that, the men start saying they cannot support a woman because women are their worst own enemies. And through this kind of training that we are doing it at university levels, and one of the things that we are doing when we capture university students who are joining the media industry in a few years, they already come with, a more aware mindset, a more changed mindset, because at an early stage, they already know some of the terminologies and kind of stereotyping that is used to undermine women especially. And we've been also identifying some of the, phrases that are used again to look down at women. For example, if somebody is driving recklessly or somebody doesn't have a huge crowd, they're saying this one is like a woman. And so this goes on. And this is what is used against women when they're vying for political seats. And through this kind of reporting, especially on gender responsive reporting, journalists can even be able to know what is gender, because when you started reporting, a lot of journalists thought gender is supposed to be women. So we have again to be training them to differentiate between what is gender, what is sex, and this has really worked very well. My colleague Winnie Siombua is very good at it, and actually she's managed to do this because she comes from a human rights background, and she's able to do that. Another thing, of course, that is done by my colleagues, for example, Mustafa Ndumbuya, is to talk about rights media. And the rights media, we have panel, and this panel shows when a story is covered, issues of accountability, participation, to ensure that all voices are represented and covered in the right way are, we see this reflected in the news content, because we have a scenario where a woman is asked, how do you balance becoming a politician and a family? But the same question cannot be directed to a man, yet a man is also a family man. So through this kind of training that we are giving to journalists, and actually I'm happy because in some of the stories we are getting, already we can see the impact of this kind of training. And also the working with the CSOs will also help demystify some of these, phrases that are always used to look down upon the woman and, continue to violate her father. And I've seen this one really working. And you can imagine now, Rachel, we've reached more than 200 journalists. We've also reached quite a huge number of CSOs, and we're still continuing with more and more engagements. And even the students in a few coming weeks, we are also going to roll it out to more students. We've already trained the first bunch of the students, and I know through this kind of training that we're offering, we are likely to see the media stand up against some of these, kind of disparaging remarks that are used to reduce the power of the woman.
Josephine, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, well, I would just like to add that I think we need to be very precise about the language we use when telling these stories. I mean, even down to, do we use victim? Do we use survivor? Of course, in the humanitarian world, the common terms are recipients and beneficiaries for people who who are basically the clients of aid. Recipients and beneficiaries are not very empowering words at all. So how do we take a more level-headed, or I might even say compassionate point of view when we are telling the story? And also, I think we also need to think about who is telling the story in terms of, when one is looking for voices of authority, who are we going to be those voices of authority? Are we taking a 360-degree look at the situation, or are we just sort of plugging in, a representative from this organization and someone from the authorities who will speak, who more often than not are men? So I think we'd be very careful about the language we use and who are we asking to help tell the story.
Yeah. And you raise an interesting point that I know is a trope of the training work that Judy and her team are doing in Kenya. Judy, can you speak to the role of men? We talk about Women's Day, we talk about women's issues, we talk about women and girls' rights. And often in all the language of women's and girls' rights and issues, we occlude the role of men. What is, constructively speaking, the role that men can play here in this work?
Yes, when we talk about equality, this war cannot be won by only women alone. And it's been very interesting actually to see men take a step forward and actually stand for the rights of women and girls. And one thing I like about our boss here in Kenya, Sami Moraya, actually is one of the men, including as well as Mustafa and Bernard. I mean, we have these three men in our office, and I think it starts within that village, within that home. And I consider the office to be like, our home. And already when you see the men taking the lead in terms of talking about equality, talking about, supporting girls and women to access education, to participate in elections and in public life, I think for me, that's where it starts. And in Kenya, interestingly, the other day we had a campaign led by men, and it's called Men End FGM. And we have so many other organizations that are men-led, calling for the rights and protection of girls and women. And I think when we have the voice of the man, it's very powerful when a man stands and says, because like in our society, the man is elevated. The man is seen as, the head and the woman is below. So when the voice comes from the man saying that we need to protect girls from female genital mutilation, that we need girls who became mothers allowed back to school, there's power to that. And actually, the society tends to believe it. And that's why I think the more we involve men in this conversation, the more we allow men to join and actually lead this process, I think we are really going to achieve a lot, because we have really deep-seated, cultural, socioeconomic, and historic barriers that are blocking women. And that's why a lot of power, a lot of synergies, a lot of collaboration is required from both men and women to ensure the woman gets to the high table, the woman can access education and can participate freely in all spheres of life.
Very well said. Very well. Josephine, and going back to your point about being very careful about the kind of language we use, but one of the things that's always struck me as a journalist is how women's issues often encompass things like rape and sexual harassment, and what tends to be left out is who's doing the rape and who's doing the harassing. And I'm wondering if you can just speak to, in your experience as a journalist, how you've handled those kinds of questions.
Sure. Yeah, this in fact is an issue that we talk a lot about with our investigative editor, because in the SEA investigations that we do, we speak about the women, the survivors, but very rarely does a story ever move to the point where one can ever speak to or about the men who took part or in these actions. I think we are certainly making an effort to move beyond the story, in that just stating what happened is only the beginning, that we then need to push on and talk about justice, and what does justice mean, and how do you open up a conversation about what that justice might mean. Yeah, I hope that is an area that we can look at much more closely.
Mm-hmm. No, it's something that has always struck me as an anomaly of this area of journalism and coverage, is that these issues tend to be put in as blocks as women's issues when they actually have society-wide implications, and often the women are not the ones who are creating a lot of these challenges. So to Judy's point, we want to, engage men constructively and invite them in as allies in this process. But also, I think it's important to find the right ways and language to hold men to account for their behavior. And that is the piece that gets very complicated very quickly, because it's in particular when you're talking about questions of sexual exploitation and abuse, that is a very challenging conversation to have. But I think with women like you in leadership roles, we're going to be seeing a lot more of that kind of accountability journalism through this pandemic and beyond. We're now at time, which is a regret because this was an incredibly fruitful and powerful conversation. As you were speaking, Josephine, I was reminded of that quote that if hard work was truly remunerated, then all the women of sub-Saharan Africa would be multimillionaires. That never could I say that. That has been so much something that has been confirmed and reconfirmed for me as I do my work and work with people like Judy and so many others across sub-Saharan Africa and beyond. I hope that through this time, as all of these inequalities become so apparent, we are able as an international community to engage with them and make change happen and really put economic power into the hands of those who are best placed to make best use of it, such as the woman who went from selling food to ice because that's what she could do in that context in order to take care of her kids and feed her family. Amazing work, both of you. Thank you so much for coming onto this webinar, and happy International Women's Day. On we go.